Orléans or Orleans. Orleans is English for Orléans. So New Orleans is probably the most famous of the Orleans. Growing up, one of the most famous or interesting names that I thought was the last name of d'Orléans, which I found quite interesting. And in Canada, I found out that there is a place in Ontario called Orleans. Ottawa, Ontario, called Orleans. So there are many other Orleans. For example, there's Orleans in California, Indiana, Iowa, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, New York, and Vermont. Now, the idea of an Orleanist is kind of the idea of a Republican. So it states that Louis Philippe II, Joseph, Duke of Orleans, or Louis Philippe Joseph, the Duke of Orleans, in 1747 and till 1793, that was his life, was a major French noble who supported the French Revolution. He was one of those who supported the idea of republicanism, or to move away from monarchical rule, or rule of kings and queens, and away from the feudal system. So he kind of supported the French Revolution, which was because that was what the French Revolution was seeking to overturn: feudalism and rules of kings and queens. So New Orleans is in Louisiana. It's probably the most famous of the Orleans. In St. Lucia, we have Orléans in Vieux Fort, and we have another place called Orléans in Dennery. So, and then, like I said, there's Orleans all over the place, including in Brazil. So New Orleans is world renowned for its distinctive music, Creole cuisine, and its annual celebration of Mardi Gras. The historic heart of the city is the French Quarter, known for its French and Spanish Creole architecture and vibrant nightlife along Bourbon Street. The city has been described as one of the most unique cities in the United States of America. It was founded in 1718 by French colonists. New Orleans was once the territorial capital of French Louisiana before becoming part of the United States in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Like I said, it has Creole language, Carnival, Mardi Gras, and it has some common customs with other French-based or French areas with historical French ties. It also has some Spanish ties as well, as indicated by it had Spanish possession. So the Spanish were in charge of New Orleans before the purchase from the French. And don't forget the Tignon laws instituted by the Spanish Governor Don Esteban Miro of New Orleans in 1786, and that was for enslaved black women to cover their heads. So this whole idea of revolution can be summed up in the idea of the Atlantic struggles. So these were revolution, wars, and unrest in the so-called New World, right? In the Americas and the Caribbean. From the coast of the Americas, north and south, all the way into the Caribbean archipelago. There was Atlantic revolutions. It is dated from 1765 to about 1838. Lots of upheavals, wars, rebellions, slave rebellions, and all kinds of things going on. And that was between the age of the Enlightenment. From a European perspective, it is considered to have fallen in the time of the age of the Enlightenment, or ideas that criticize the absolute rule of monarchies. The aim was to end the monarchical rule, emphasizing the ideals of enlightenment and spreading liberalism. Right? So the largest of these revolutions is the most well-known, the American revolutions. But there were revolutions and upheavals all over North and South America. Simon Bolivar, in Venezuela and Colombia, Jamaica, Taki's Revolt. You have Brigands Wars going on in St. Vincent and St. Lucia. You have many revolts and revolutions going on, all part of this idea of the Duke of Orleans supporting Republican rule, moving away from the absolute rule of monarchies, and you have this culminating in this big French Revolution off with the head in Paris, and then the ending of monarch rule in Paris. So the French Revolution is considered a major marker of those change from feudal system into new liberal rules. So these are considered the fundamental principle of liberal democracies after the French Revolution instituted the new regime, or the new idea, move from the old regime to liberal rule. So it is a combination of social and political factors which moved that caused the toppling of the ancient regime, which was the rule of kings and queens. Now the ancient regime, probably you could say, ruled from like the 1500s to about the 1789 when the French Revolution occurred. So it ended with the storming of the Bastille on 14th July 1789, and which led to a series of radical measures by the assembly of the people during the French Revolution in Paris, and the abolition of feudalism, the imposition of state control over the Catholic Church in France, and the extension of the right to vote. Of course, you had Austria, Britain, Prussia, and some of the other allies and external powers. They sought to restore ancient regime by force, or they were fighting against this idea of liberal rules because there were some who were royalists, who wanted to keep the old feudal system going, and so there was the counter-revolutionaries, not just in Europe, but also there were patriots, there were republicans and revolutionists, even in the Atlantic as well as in Europe. So in the Atlantic or in the Caribbean, we would be probably not too familiar, but there's a gentleman called Victor Hughes. He's perhaps best known for authorizing privateers to attack shipping through the Caribbean, which brought great wealth to the island, but also was part of the tension between France and the United States, which caused something called the quasi-war between France and America, which is a very short war. But basically, Victor Hughes came down in the Caribbean based on the French Revolution and started fighting against the Americans on the sea, or a navy war. Okay, so basically Victor Hughes, with an army composed of white mulatto people, ex-slave soldiers, Hughes worked to export the revolution to neighboring islands from Guadeloupe, including Dominica, St. Martin, Grenada, St. Vincent, and St. Lucia. On 18th April 1795, he landed in St. Lucia with 600 soldiers. They joined the 250 local white Republicans and 300 black Republicans, most of them carrying pikes, but some with captured muskets from the local garrison. The British from Castries landed over 1,000 troops at Vieux-Fort and Castries in St. Lucia and marched them overland to Soufrière. They attacked on April 22nd at Fondor and Rabault. The royalist French planters eventually fled, leaving the slaves to be liberated. In St. Lucia, after the Revolution, the Peace of Paris, 1783, 300 plantations had been abandoned. Some 1,000 of Maroons lived in the interior of St. Lucia after that. That was part of the aftermath in St. Lucia of the French Revolution. These things occurred all over in different places. The reverberations, for example, you had names like Jean-Baptiste Bidault, you look them up, Flore Bois-Guilad, Taki War, Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and also Alexandre Dumas, the Count of Monte Cristo book is written about him. Joseph Boulogne, Chevalier de Saint Georges, Fédon's Rebellion, also known as the Brigands' War. Fédon March of 1795 to 1796 was an uprising against British rule in Grenada. Although a significant number of slaves were involved, they fought on both sides, the majority being on the side of Fédon and his forces, predominantly led by free mixed-race French speakers, and stated purpose was to create a black republic and had already occurred in neighboring island of Haiti, rather than to free slaves, so it's not properly called a slave rebellion, although freedom of the slaves would have been a consequence of its success under the leadership of Julien Fédon. Note, okay, the owner of the plantation in a mountainous interior of the island, encouraged by French revolutionary leaders from Guadeloupe. There was the Stoner Rebellion, New York conspiracy, Gabriel's conspiracy, German Coast uprising, Nat Turner rebellion in 1831, and of course the most famous of these was the American Civil War that culminated. So all these things culminated with the American Civil War, and then came the abolition of slavery in the American Congress. So all these upheavals led eventually to the American Civil War. Now keep in mind, this is not the idea that it benefited the enslaved people and the natives. This was more of a fight for merchants and rich Europeans to get power away from kings and queens. So the struggle continued, right? So New Orleans was the most famous of these places, and you have the Orleans, and you have the anti-oil regime from monarchical rule to liberal democracies. Didn't really benefit the African population and the native population, although they said liberty, egalitarianism and fraternity or brotherhood was not extended to the enslaved and the natives when all the smoke settled. So this is framed in a European struggle narrative, and it did not really benefit the black and the native people in the stories. The struggles continued, right? So we moved from a feudal system to a liberal democracy system. We are living in a new epoch right now where changes are being made as well. China, India, new countries are becoming powerful. So another change of system is probably presently occurring. So we moved from we started off with the idea of Orleans or Orleans spread around the world, and we ended up having a look at revolutions around the Atlantic. If you like the